Mm, Thank you very much for joining this evening. As many of you know, this is Cult. We are an online platform that aims to make art more accessible to a primarily young and non-specialist audience. And we hold live sessions online once a week and in-person sessions once a month. And we're also producing short format content for you to watch at your own leisure, which I will be letting you all know about shortly. Happy Valentine's. As you can see, I've decided to wear my red velvet jacket this evening in honor of Valentine's Day, and also in honor of Titian, who we're going to be talking about this evening, who really is the master of fabric. And this is a velvet jacket, so it made me think of Titian in all his glory. However, we're not going to be looking at a portrait by Titian this evening. We're going to be looking at one of his great mythological paintings, the Flaying of Marsyas, which follows our series on emotion. This week we'll be looking at pain in this painting, and I'm aware of the irony of the fact that we are going to be looking at a painting depicting pain on Valentine's Day. However, I had intended to start this series 1 week earlier than we in fact did. So my programming was slightly off. And next week, we will be looking at a painting depicting passion. So we're one week behind ourselves, but hopefully that might even add a bit more salt and pepper to everyone's evening. So I think what we'll do, as always, is we will get cracking right away. The format, for those who haven't joined before, is that I share the painting for the duration of the session, an image of the painting, so that we really can immerse ourselves in it and get to know the picture. So to kick things off, this is the Flaying of Marcias by Titian. And I should admit right away that I have actually never been fortunate enough to see this painting in the flesh. It lives in the Czech Republic in a place called Olomouc, where there is quite an extraordinary collection. And this painting made its way there in the 17th century, and we'll talk more about that later. So I had to really sort of look into the size of the painting, the medium, and I'm also very aware that paintings like this from Titian's late period really are certainly better to see in person. And that's largely to do with this technique, which we will talk about, which he sort of shifts into in the 1550s. However, to give those of you who also haven't seen this painting in the flesh, so to speak, a better idea of what we're looking at. The painting is it's just over 2 meters high, so it's an enormous picture. And as always with Titian, it's oil on canvas. And we have at the center of the canvas an upside down body with a belly button right in the middle of the painting. We have multiple figures surrounding this body that is upside down. You will notice that the body is suspended from a tree with red ribbons, and around it are several figures. On the left, we have figures at 3 different heights. At the top, there is a figure playing what is known as a lira da braccio, which is a sort of ancestor of a violin. It sort of had more strings than a violin and was slightly larger. A popular instrument in Italy in the 16th century. So we have a figure playing this musical instrument, looking to the heavens. There is a man wearing a hat at mid-level, or just above mid-level. And then lower left, we have a kneeling figure, pretty much in the nude, leaning towards the figure at the center and seen in profile. On the right side, we have what is known as a satyr, so half goat, half man, and he is holding a bucket, and he is also about mid-level. Below him, there is an old man looking towards the head of the figure that is suspended from the tree, hanging upside down, and with his head resting in his left hand. And then in the lower right corner, a young boy or young satyr, a very large dog, and then right at the center, at the bottom, is a very small dog. So there's something for everyone, for the dog lovers out there. Around all of these figures is a sort of, I've seen it quoted as, which I thought was so fantastic, an unbreathable landscape. This very murky, smoky collection of leaves and clouds and sky and trees. And of course, a sort of darker area in the lower register denoting the floor. There is an awful lot going on in the painting. And one of the first things you've probably noticed is that the figure suspended from the tree has legs, also has legs of a goat. And he's also, I'm going to zoom in for this, he is also awake. His eyes are wide open, and there is blood dripping from his left upper arm, and there's a pool of blood beneath his hands. Who are we looking at? So this is a figure called Marcias, and we are looking at a scene from the story of Marcias, or the story of Marcias's death. He was a satyr, so as we've said, half goat, half man, who challenged the god Apollo, the god of music, and one of the most beautiful gods. He challenged him to a musical contest. Marcias was known for playing the double flute, which in the 16th century ended up really being depicted as panpipes. So you will have noticed I did not mention the panpipes that were hanging from the tree upper left. So that is evidence that we are looking at Marcias. He played the panpipes. He challenged the god Apollo to a musical contest. Apollo typically played the lyre, and here that's been replaced by this instrument, the lira da braccio, which was more typical in the 16th century. This story was an ancient Greek myth, but was told in Ovid's Metamorphoses, and that is the source that Titian is using for this painting, Ovid being the great Roman poet who writes his most famous work, the Metamorphoses, from which, as I say, from which this story is taken. In Ovid, he describes the flaying of Marsyas in great detail, but doesn't really describe the contest. So what happened? He challenged Apollo to a musical contest, and naturally, because he is a mere mortal and Apollo is a god, he lost. And Apollo had said whoever loses it is allowed to inflict whatever punishment they want on their opposition. And this is a message or a moral story that was known as displaying the qualities, I suppose, of hubris. Hubris being a Greek word, which many of you may heard, which basically means arrogance or overconfidence. And it was often an element of Greek mythology to sort of warn you from not disobeying or challenging the gods. So you see hubris come up again and again when mortals think they can take on immortals. And the moral of the story is that you always end up paying for it. And that's exactly what we see happening here to poor Marsyas, who naturally lost the contest. His panpipes have been strung up almost comically next to him, and he has been strung up by the feet from this tree. And his punishment was that he was skinned or flayed alive. This painting is one of the sort of most well, for me, I find it one of the most gory paintings really in the history of art, because it's surprising in the sense that it's a calm composition, and we'll work our way through it shortly, but the act is so horrific and so terrible that only really when you sort of spend a bit of time looking at it do you really understand what's happening. Notice, for example, the figure lower left pulling his skin with his left hand away from his body. So Marcias is in the early stages of being flayed here, but he's been strung up like an animal, perhaps like you might see a carcass being hung from the ceiling in a butcher. So he is being really reduced almost to animal, well, certainly to animal status. And the decision to portray him upside down is one that Titian had taken and was rather unusual. There's a very well-known Greek sculpture of Marcias in the Louvre, which was a type which shows him a very slim figure with his arms tied above his head. And this is turned on its head quite literally by Titian. Titian has been drawing on the composition of other artists for this story, compositions of other artists for this story, notably a pupil of Raphael, an artist called Giulio Romano, who makes a drawing of this subject, and the composition is very, very similar to this. And the drawing was translated obviously into a painting, which was a fresco in the Palazzo Te in Mantua, for whom Titian works later on earlier on in his career. So he will have seen this composition. However, let's work our way around the picture. Who are we looking at? Marsyas is obviously at the center, hung upside down. Lower left, we have Apollo. So his opponent, noticeable by the laurel wreath that Apollo wears around his head. That is Apollo's attribute. If you see a god wearing a laurel wreath around its head, it's more than likely going to be Apollo, which also comes from a story in the Metamorphoses by Ovid, or told by Ovid, which was Apollo and Daphne when he chases after Daphne, and she turns herself into a laurel tree. So the wreath worn around Apollo's head is a reference to Daphne, who he fell in love with. And Apollo painstakingly uses this glimmering knife to cut away at the flesh of Marcias at the center. And he is taking great pleasure in carrying out this act, in my view, and doing it incredibly carefully, almost as if he's focused himself on creating a painting or a sculpture. And this is certainly a punishment that he's relishing. There has been discussion that this figure playing the, let's call it violin, is also Apollo in a different moment, but it may also be Orpheus or Olympus, two pupils of Marcias, music pupils, who Apollo then sort of took over and taught them to play the lyre, his own instrument, which here we see as the Lyra di Braccio. So it's certainly a figure associated with the god Apollo. And the man wearing the cap with this beautiful arm just just sort of notice how Titian sculpts his body through these very broad and blotchy, this broad and blotchy range of different colors and highlights and shadows. We get a sense of very muscular arm, very concentrated also, that glinting knife, and he's really committed to the job. He's wearing a Phrygian cap, Phrygia being modern day Turkey, and this sort of locates the whole scene as being in Phrygia. Moving over, let's start with the old man here. This is King Mideast, who was a mythical ruler of Phrygia. There is a similar story called the Judgment of Mideast, which is also a musical contest between Apollo and Pan, not Marsyas. And often these two stories were conflated. We know this is Mideast. He's wearing a crown on his head, which is very clearly defined by Titian rather than sort of loosely, which we see in a lot of the rest of the painting, which we'll talk about in a bit. And he is looking down in, again, a very pensive, tranquil disposition. He's looking down at the head of Marcias, and almost despairing of the situation. And this, again, this beautifully sculpted arm, this pose, he is lifting from several other compositions. For example, Raphael's depiction of Michelangelo in the Vatican apartments in the Stanze. Raphael paints Michelangelo in the School of Athens in this exact pose, with his head in his hands, this very pensive pose, and also Dürer in his Melancholia 1, famous, beautiful, famous print of melancholy. Above him is this other satyr who is taking glee in the situation, holding this bucket, very, very disturbing image of him holding a bucket, whether it's for blood or for skin, but he's prepared to sweep up the pieces from this, quite literally from this operation. And then on the far right, we have this quite awkward looking satyr little boy or little satyr holding back this dog who's frothing at the mouth, trying to get to the meat, or to the blood in the foreground that the other little dog has scampered forward and is already lapping up rather horrifically. I think it's this rock here, but I wouldn't be sure, but I'm assuming, I read that it was on a rock, so I'm assuming it's that one, that the painting is in fact signed by Titian. The canvas was extended on either edge and cut top and bottom sometime in the 18th century, which may have something to do with this slightly awkward small child. The figure of the child and the dog was actually, the child and the dog were actually added sort of later. We're not quite sure when, but they weren't a part of the original composition. A couple of compositional features that I think are worth pointing out. This V shape that is created by the legs of Marcias, this is actually replicated, if you look, by the forearms of the four figures surrounding Marcias. So the figure, the two figures on the left with the knives have this bent, their bent right arm, and the figures on the right have bent left arms, both Mideast and the satyr behind. So you have this echo of the V in the arms of the figures, and you also have these two diagonals of Mideast looking down at the ground or looking down at Marcias's face, and the violin player looking up. So you have these very strong compositional lines. The bow of the violin player is repeated in the knife of the man flaying Marsyas in the Phrygian cap. So you have these kind of repeated lines within the painting, which of course all kind of condense it and bring it into this, will sort of help bring it into this central moment, or draw attention to the subject at hand, which of course is Marcias. The same happens, of course, with the knife held by Apollo, and his the arm of the satyr on the other side of the body. So you have these harmonious lines in the composition. So Titian's style in his later years becomes very, very different. For those of you who know paintings by Titian, you may be thinking, well, this doesn't look like the painting I know, or this looks very like the painting I know, because his paintings go through a sort of transformation. In the early years of the 16th century, his paintings are they're always quite soft. Famously, Venetian artists were focused on color, or so Vasari said, rather than line and design. So very, very different to the Florentine painters, who were very focused on the contours and the outline of the figure. Titian was always focused on the color and the fabric and the feeling, I suppose, and the color. But in his late works, so in the early works, they're much crisper, not completely crisp as a Florentine or a Central Italian work, but they're sort of cleaner compositions. He paints a lot of portraits in the sort of first few all the way through really, but these early portraits in the first couple of decades of the 16th century are much crisper. And really from the 1550s, as I said, he starts to paint very, very loosely. Now, this painting was probably painted, almost certainly was painted when Titian was in his 80s, edging into his late 80s. So as with Monet, in Monet's late works, he was losing his eyesight. There surely is an element of that with Titian's painting. However, not wanting to reduce it to his visual impairment, because there is also an intentional way of painting in order to, create a different effect. So not everything in this painting is very loosely painted. It's all in a looser style, but it becomes so abstract. For example, if we go into the trees, and unfortunately, this is the best image I could find, but we don't know what we're looking at here. We're looking at dabs of different colors of a similar palette, but you get these flashes of blue in here. If we go lower left, again on the ground, this extraordinarily abstract patch of yellow, blue, and red. But if we look at that in contrast to this quite sort of defined face and head of Apollo, the arm, as we've discussed, of this figure, if you can, and of course the laurel wreath and the diadem that we were talking about, the crown, these very much more clearly defined objects here and here as well. So what he's doing is he's shifting the focus. He's shifting the protagonists of the picture, or what we need to be looking at, i.e. the subject, into focus, and the background, or the less important parts of the painting. Landscape was always important for Titian. But that becomes subsidiary and supporting. And in that role, he uses it to create atmosphere. So it's not dissimilar, I was thinking, looking at this picture, it's not dissimilar to a photographer. By blurring out the background, you draw attention to the activity in the foreground. And that's what we see here happening here. We know that Titian was painting with his fingers at the end of his career as well. And this is how he would have created this very blurred technique. And he also was intent on using these flashes of white, what's known as white heightening. So flashes of white paint that give the impression of light hitting a surface. So probably the best example on an object would be the white heightening on this bucket. If you look very abstractly, those are dabs of white paint, and also on the handle. The knife is highlighted by white heightening. The knife is highlighted by white heightening. In the sky, he uses these very loose dabs of white paint. He also uses red. So we have a very bright red pool of blood here, crimson, vermilion red, very, very acute red color. That's obviously drawing attention to the blood, but that is repeated from moment to moment throughout the painting. And it draws our eye around the picture in a circle. He does the same with blue, notice it here, and then flashes in the sky. And these are all intentional stylistic or technical choices. And this is something that Titian is copied throughout the history of art, really. He's these flashes of bright color are used all the time by Rubens, particularly white and red. I think we've talked before, Canaletto uses these flashes of white and red as devices to guide our eye around a painting. And really, this loose technique is so terribly modern for the 1570s when this picture was painted. This is a precursor to, of course, Rembrandt, who paints in a very loose style towards the end of his career, sort of just short of 100 years later. If we think of Turner, particularly Turner's late works, of course, we've mentioned Monet. Artists looked at Titian, and he was ahead of the game. He was pioneering technically in this respect. So I mentioned that this is painted in the 1570s. Titian was born in, we don't exactly know his birth date, but he was probably born around 1490. He was active by 1506. So his early works are really the first couple of decades of the 16th century. And he was born in a small town called Pieve di Cadore, which is in the Dolomites, on the sort of Venetian side of the Alps. And he was born to a military father. His brother Francesco was a painter. And at the age of 10, he was in Venice, not far from Pieve di Cadore. He'd gone to Venice, and he starts training with the great Venetian painter Giovanni Bellini, who, if any of you know Giovanni Bellini's works, they are particularly crisp and beautifully lit and compositionally very harmonious, but a far cry from something like this. So he works with Bellini there. And throughout his career, he really has this unique position of developing relationships with very powerful people, mainly in Italy, at least to begin with, but remaining in Venice. So he seems to have his cake and eat it, in a sense, because he lives in Venice and that's where he works. That's where his studio is. But he works for the Duke Alfonso d'Este in Ferrara. He spends some time in Ferrara working there for what was known as the Alabaster Room that Alfonso d'Este commissioned for from several of the leading artists of the period, which was in his palace, a small room in his palace. He works for the Duke of Mantua, the Gonzaga, Federico II Gonzaga. He works for the Duke of Urbino. He works for, ultimately, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and then his son, Philip II of Spain. So that last patron, Philip II, really kind of becomes his most important patron. Well, Charles V, I suppose, was his breakthrough into not only sort of only working for dukes, but also working for an imperial court, the Holy Roman Emperor, and then subsequently for Philip II. And it's for Philip II that Titian paints what are known as his poesie, which are episodes from Ovid's Metamorphoses. And there is amazing documentation, exchanges between Titian and Philip about this commission. So it's very well documented, and the collection of paintings are split between several museums, including the National Gallery in London, where there was an exhibition on the poesie very recently. And this painting, of course, fits into the this idea of the poesie. It's an Ovidian myth, and it's a late painting, but there is no evidence to suggest that it was part of this series. It is, as I say, typical of his late style. It's in fact really his sort of farewell to his mythologies, this painting. It's really his kind of last great mythology. And its kind of counterpart being the Pietà, which a number of you may have seen, which is in the Accademia Gallery in Venice, which was really his farewell to religious painting. And that was destined to hang above his own tomb, but in fact, in the Frari church in Venice, for those who know, but in fact it was left unfinished, and he probably died while painting it, and it was finished by an artist in Venice afterwards, and there's an inscription on it to explain that. Whereas this is largely deemed as a finished painting. And that's what it becomes quite tricky in these late years to determine which are finished and which are unfinished, because of their very loose and sketchy style. So the painting was painted in the 1570s. Titian dies in 1576. He dies of the plague. And we don't know anything about the commission or the early history of the picture. It was first recorded in the collection of the Arundel family in 1655. So Thomas Howard, the Earl of Arundel, was one of the greatest collectors in London in the first half of the 17th century, and was a close courtier of Charles I and James I, actually. He was slightly older than Charles I, but this painting was in his collection. He was very much a connoisseur. Charles I was a collector, and he liked fashion and trends, and he had many people telling him what to buy. He loved Titian, which of course is why he then ends up loving Van Dyck, because Van Dyck himself too, he also loved Titian. But Arundel was much more of a, as I say, much more of a connoisseur, and he and his wife spent a great amount of time in the Low Countries. Charles I never visited Italy, whereas the Arundels travelled, sorry, not the Low Countries, travelled the continent. They did go to the Low Countries in the 16 teens, but they went to Venice in the 1620s, and Lady Arundel, Alethea Talbot, she stays there for several years alone. And it may have been during the 1620s that they purchased this painting. Anyway, it's part of their collection. It's inventoried in 1655. And then after Alethea Talbot's death, her son sells off a lot of the collection. Much of it had sort of been dispersed already, but the entire collection is dispersed. And this painting is bought by the nephew of a German banker called Jarbach, I think is how you pronounce it, with a J, Everard Jarbach, who was a major figure. He had one of the most amazing collections in the 17th century, and he bought a great deal at the sale of Charles I's collection. Stay with me. So he was a major figure. He was acquiring paintings left, right, and center. He bought this from the Arundels. And then in 63, it comes up for auction in Vienna in 1670, and then in 1673 it is acquired by the Archbishop of Olomouc, and that is where a lot of his collection is acquired by Olomouc Jarbach. So this was owned by his nephew, but a lot of Jarbach's collection was owned by Olomouc. And this is where the painting remains today. I think that's probably most of what I wanted to say. Titian, if for those who haven't noticed, was probably the greatest painter of dogs. Another thing just to point out, this drooling dog wanting to get in with his lovely side eye. In fact, quite beautifully reflected in the eye of Marsyas. And Marcias has this strange sort of smiling expression. The whole painting is frenzied, but it's also incredibly calm. And I think that's why it's quite eerie, because it's all happening quite painfully slow, but this chaotic brushwork gives a sense of discord and discomfort. And actually, as a final point, the painting to me is full of opposites. It's full of pain, but also beauty, as we noticed, not only in terms of the whole painting, but also these individual figures, their anatomy. It's also, it's horror, but it's also kind of the sublime. The idea of this flaying of a body was sometimes interpreted as the freeing of the spirit from the human body. So the idea of going heavenwards and life carrying on. This is something Michelangelo talks about in his sonnets. So there are also, interpretations as to a sort of Neoplatonic or philosophical interpretation of this painting. And in fact, Iris Murdoch, the novelist, absolutely adored this painting. It came to London in 1983 at the Royal Academy. There was a huge show of Venetian painting. And it really was the star of the show. And people were so astonished by this picture. I think for all of the reasons that I've mentioned. And she actually talks about it in 3 of her novels. and she talks about this ambiguity of the picture, and how it's so horrific, but also so beautiful and seductive as well. So I'll keep the painting on screen. I don't know if anyone has any questions. If you do, please pop them in the chat and I will do my best to answer. Or any comments about the picture, anything that particularly jumps out. Please don't feel pressured, but if there is anything. Thank you, Jonathan. Is he still Marsyas when he has been flayed? I think he's probably an interred Marcias once he's been flayed. I don't think he does transform into anything else, but it's a very good question because, of course, the Metamorphoses is all about metamorphosis and transformation. So I suppose in this story, he is being transformed by having his skin removed. I should also mention actually that there's I feel a kind of religious undertone to this painting. St. Peter was martyred upside down. So the idea of flipping him upside down, which was quite innovative in the 16th century, as I say, may have had something to do with this iconography of St. Peter on the cross. And the other thing is St. Bartholomew, who is martyred by being skinned alive, and Michelangelo includes Bartholomew holding his skin in the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, which he wouldn't have seen, because Titian actually does visit Rome in the he would have seen, sorry, Titian visits Rome in the 1540s, and Michelangelo finishes the Last Judgment in 1534, I think. So he would have seen this St. Bartholomew holding the skin. So that may have, and they met. So that's quite nice to think about. I agree, the upside down idea is really rich. Exactly, the idea of inversion. And I've seen somewhere that it says that Marcias is smiling, but I think that's just because he's upside down. He doesn't really look like he's smiling to me. But he's awake, which makes the whole thing far more disturbing. Right, if that is everything, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and do please feel free to send any questions or any comments you might have. And otherwise, we will be next week looking at something quite different. We'll be looking at Passion. We will be looking at Venus and Mars by Botticelli. So much more of a focus on design and drawing than necessarily colour and loose brushwork. But if you do want to see any late paintings by Titian, do go to the National Gallery, because there's a great collection of late works by Titian there. Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming, and I look forward to seeing you all next Monday, same time, same place. Thank you.